in 1973, we had this situation. Remember, we didn't have floating exchange rates, and we had a lot of pressure on the currency. There was a lot of pressure to revalue the currency, and we did that. But we also took the opportunity to cut tariffs because the economy was booming. We didn't have enough labour. Inflation was taking off. So this was a great opportunity to achieve longer-term goals in a way that was very consistent with short-term imperatives. That was early neoliberalism, and it was a success. So in a way, HECS is a nice segue because it shows you that these arguments that the neoliberals put were right and powerful, but they weren't complete. So it's absolutely true that free education with the same existing tax system is, certainly in the short term, a transfer of wealth, transfer income to the well-off and moderately well-off from the poor, or not the poor, but the working poor. So that should have been factored in. It wasn't factored in. So one of the things neoliberalism did is that it, modern university education, it kind of compartmentalised things, and it said, university fees, we're going to talk about that as its own system. And there's some sense to do that, but it's all in a larger system, and we've got to try and do both things.
Some other successes of what they call neoliberalism. Now, I'm a bit reluctant to use the term because it seems to be always used pejoratively.
Yeah.
You're this neoliberal economist, as a way of dismissing what economists say.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality. And my guest, not looking uncomfortable, is Jean Tunney. My colleague, Jean Tunney, and this podcast, this discussion came out of an email that Jean sent me as he was reflecting on some of the work we've been doing over the last 6 months. Jean, please explain what the story is.
Yes, well, thanks, Nicholas. Good to be with you again. What I was reflecting on was that it seems that in a number of policy areas now, we seem to be struggling as a nation, whereas I remember when I was in Treasury, we told ourselves a story about how we were exceptional in policy. There was this view of Australian policy exceptionalism, and that was behind our recovery in terms of GDP per capita relative to our OECD peers. We had a productivity surge in the late 90s, and that allowed us to catch up with other OECD economies. And so we essentially moved from the bottom third of the OECD, the 24 countries as it then was, to the top third, so the top 8. And there was a feeling that in large part this was due to the era of microeconomic reform of which you were part of. And I mean, I'd like to explore that with you. And somehow we just seem to have lost that policy exceptionalism. I mean, I look at various different areas of policy. Energy policy is one, for example, where we're really not performing as we once did. I mean, things seem to be in a real bit of a mess. So I thought it would be good to discuss that. And I mean, what's the way forward that we might see, if there is a way forward?
Yeah. Well, it's a subject that I've thought about a lot, and I can't sort of give you any easy answers. I can certainly give you plenty of thoughts. And I guess this sort of happens a lot when new movements turn up, and the movement we're talking about, whether we use it as a swear word or as a word of allegiance, is neoliberalism. And around the world, actually, it's certainly true of the United States, and it's absolutely true of Australia. Australia is an exemplar here. The early neoliberalism was a left-of-centre project. It was taken most seriously by the left. And by the left, I mean the centre left, and I mean people like Jimmy Carter, who had the audacity to spark pretty dramatic airline deregulation. They had a highly regulated, ridiculously regulated civil aviation sector in which Delta Airways, if they existed, would apply to the government to say, we want to go on a new route, and then there'd be lots of discussion about whether they'd be allowed to, and that even got to them clearing menus of the food that would be served on these routes. It's pretty obvious that regulation, if there was ever any sense to it, it was clearly wildly overregulated and stupidly overregulated, and we had that sort of thing as well. And in fact, my father had been part of a kind of a movement in which, he was an economist, and this was a time of triumph for economists. But the way I saw it when I was young is that he was university educated, and his role in society was to at least make the case as to how we could run this system better. And he was an agricultural economist. And one of the things that I remember, I think I now remember this in retrospect. I think I heard him talking about it, but I know something of the policy background, which is that in Australia in the 1960s, it was illegal to put yellow dye in margarine. And Jean, I don't know whether you know that, but you can probably extemporise now and say why that rule existed. Why do you think it existed?
Would it be unfair competition with butter?
Yes, exactly. It'd be terrible for farmers. It'd be terrible, it was against the human rights of farmers. And you can see, it's easy to make this stuff up. We don't want to mislead people. You can smuggle in these holier-than-thou excuses for what you're doing, and what you're doing is what we see every day, which is, we see lawyers do it and surgeons do it, and we're not doing much about that today, just as we weren't doing anything about this kind of nonsense from farmers and from wharfies on the labour side of things back then. And so neoliberalism, in my experience, is a revolt against businesses, politics as usual, and you'll find some marvellous descriptions of politics as usual in Adam Smith from 200 years previously, which is businessmen. They were men in his day. They're still mostly men today. Seldom meet, even for merriment, but that the conversation turns to some conspiracy against the public.
Yeah, to fix prices or something like that.
That's right, or contrivance to fix prices. That's right.
Can I ask about your father, for those who don't know? Fred Gruen, he was an advisor to Prime Minister Whitlam, wasn't he?
Yes, and he was a bit unusual in that regard. But he was a professor of agricultural economics who at the end of 1972, picked up Trevor Swan's chair. Trevor Swan was a great Nobel Prize quality economist that Australia produced, but all his Nobel Prize quality work wasn't even published. It's circulated around Canberra, but something known as the growth theory. He was an innovator in growth theory, and there's the Solo Swan model of growth, I think it's called, or it's a Solo Swan model, or maybe it's the Solo Swan model of internal and external balance.
It's both. There's the Swan-Salter model, which is internal and external balance, and then there's the Solo Swan growth model, which is the neoclassical growth model. So he had two innovations. Yeah,
that's right. And he was that good. And I don't think either of those were published. Certainly certainly the internal and external balance stuff wasn't, which was basically a diagram, wasn't published. It circulated around Canberra. So Dad got that gig at the end of 1972, and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet were looking round for an external advisor, a consultant, if you like. And it wasn't the Prime Minister. I think my father was quite proud of the fact that he was a consultant to the Prime Minister's department, not a political mate of the Prime Minister, although he would have voted for that Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. And so he then had a problem because he just accepted this job. I think this is also a nice thing to talk about because it talks about a world that's more or less gone. And that is that he just accepted the chair in this position at ANU, and along came this job that he would have loved to do, and he basically said, well, I won't do it if the university doesn't want me to do it because I've agreed to do this other job. I don't think that sort of happens very much these days. And so that was worked out, and he was a part-time consultant to the Prime Minister's department, and he had been an advocate for economic reform, for freer trade, which was really almost every Australian agricultural economist was an advocate for freer trade, but all kinds of things. At the same time, his great friend Alan Lloyd was a great campaigner for a thing called the Little Desert. So he was an early environmentalist. He was saying, look, we're now developing this land, which is the Ord River in WA was another famous example where it was economists who said this recipe for development is a scam. It won't work. We're not getting the right advice, and it's being driven by private interests. And the Little Desert, a minister in the Victorian government had a holiday home or something and wanted a road built to the Little Desert. Now, there may be more to it than that, but this Little Desert needed to be a national park. And Alan Lloyd, an economist, helped galvanise. He was one of the early campaigners for this. Now, my father wasn't nearly as strong an environmentalist. He wasn't an environmental campaigner, but it was the same kind of mentality, which is we want a civilised life here. Economists are there to help us be rational in pursuing a civilised and rewarding life, not just to optimise GDP. Optimising GDP is a great thing to do. Other things being equal, other things are never equal, and therefore we try to make the appropriate compromises in our ignorance as we go.
Yes, okay. And so, so is that a good place to start with the reform era, if you'd call it that in Australia?
Yeah, so that was kind of what I was getting at. So it's kind of London to a brick at that stage. For any, I don't know whether that's an English saying, or I suppose it must be an English saying, not an Australian saying. I'm thinking of our international listeners, but it's kind of obvious that at that early stage, there is lots of low-hanging fruit. There's lots of worthwhile things to do, a lot of completely crazy and borderline corrupt things going on. And by corrupt here, I don't mean that money is necessarily changing hands. I mean in the sense that Adam Smith meant it, that government decisions are being influenced by private, to advantage private people and to advantage private interests. And so this was the early part of economic reform. Gough Whitlam himself was, if you kind of look through the chaos, this was an important part of Gough Whitlam's political rhetoric, which is that the superphosphate bounty should be justified on economic grounds, and we're going to take it off the farmers because we're doing a bunch of other more sensible things. And of course, that turned into a big political bun fight. And likewise, we're going to take the opportunity. In 1973, we had this situation. Remember, we didn't have floating exchange rates, and we had a lot of pressure on the currency. There was a lot of pressure to revalue the currency, and we did that, as I recall. But we also took the opportunity to cut tariffs because the economy was booming. We didn't have enough labour. Inflation was taking off. So this was a great opportunity to achieve longer-term goals in a way that was very consistent with short-term imperatives. So that was early That was early neoliberalism, and it was a success. Then along comes a massive recession. And this is somewhat unfair to Malcolm Fraser's government, but not terribly unfair. Malcolm Fraser wins government promising jobs, not dogma. Malcolm Fraser is part of an operation which blames unemployment on tariff cuts. It wasn't tariff cuts. Very little of it was tariff cuts. Most of it is macroeconomic. Most of it's the state of the economy, which is a different thing. And Whitlam can take some reverse credit for that. Whitlam's management of the economy was far from exemplary management of the macroeconomy. And the other main thing that was leading to large-scale layoffs in Australia was equal pay for women, particularly in textiles, clothing and footwear. Well, no government, so Malcolm Fraser wasn't going to come out and say it was equal wages for women that did it. So this thing suffers from politics. I don't want to be overly critical of Malcolm Fraser. It's a bit like being critical of lions for eating meat. That's kind of what, or business people for making profits. That's kind of what they have to do to stay in business. But then after, with this sort of promising, towards the end of his reign, towards the end of Malcolm Fraser's reign, he became famous for giving speeches overseas talking about how great free trade was and arguing for countries to embrace free trade, and coming back to Australia and not doing a damn thing about our very high protection levels. And that sort of set the scene for the Hawke government and the glory days, which lasted until arguably the first third of the Howard government, from the whole of the Hawke-Keating government, and then in economic terms until 2001.
Yeah. Okay. And, Fraser government famously sat on was it the Campbell inquiry report into the financial system?
I think that's right. That's right. And then it was the Martin inquiry that the Hawke government had when it got in. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And so I think there's a general recognition among conservatives in Australia that the Fraser years were a wasted opportunity to reform the economy, to make it more competitive.
And I recall, I think it was this was 2003. I think it was, it would have been, it was 2003, rather an interesting time, because I went to a dinner that was put on by people associated with the think tank you're associated with, the CI, the Centre for Independent Studies, a right-leaning think tank. Now it wasn't an official function. It was a whole bunch of people like Andrew Norton and a bunch of other people. It was a dinner. It was just a dinner in Melbourne. It was a dinner to celebrate the election of the Hawke Labor government in 1983, because that was seen as the beginning of Australia getting serious about economic reform, becoming better than pretty much anyone else in the world. And I think held in 2003, people were already starting to be anxious that the Howard government really, having done its having kind of had a near-death experience with the GST, just sort of improvised away. We know that when it got control of the Senate, it then went into another reform paroxysm, which killed it off. At least that's the folklore. But Howard, I think of Howard as a very momentum-free politician. He was a good politician in a number of respects, and I use that term as in terms of virtuosity rather than virtue. He was good at what he did, and he had a certain idea about what he wanted, and I'm not very sympathetic with that. But I have some sympathy for it now in the age of wokedom, of talking about things like practical reconciliation rather than symbolic stuff. But then, anyway, that's another topic. But Howard lost momentum almost immediately on gaining office. The business community was very upset about it. I was working for the Business Council at the time, and it was an attempt, a reasonable interpretation is that it was an attempt to respond to that listlessness that Howard said, we're going to have tax reform. And that turned into another major reform episode in Australia. And that was kind of the last one.
Yeah, yeah. So it'd be good to talk about Hawke and Keating. I mean, very consequential government that essentially brought about the end of what Paul Kelly called the Australian settlement.
Yeah.
This is something I talked about with my friend Darren Nelson on a recent episode of my podcast, Economics Explored. You know, the conciliation and arbitration, the very rigid IR regulation, the tariff wall, White Australia policy, although that ended under Whitlam, I suppose, but that had ended before.
It had sort of ended before, yeah. I think Gordon pretty much
and then
killed it.
There are a couple of other elements of the I might have been imperial preference that had already gone, and there was one more element, maybe state paternalism, I think it was. His 5 elements of the Australian settlement, and that really shook things up. It got rid of the tariff wall, as I'm sure we'll talk about, and various other policy innovations. Can I ask, how did you get involved in it to begin with? You were an advisor to John Button, were you?
Yeah, I was an advisor to John Button. It was my first job out of uni. And I got the job, I think this is how I got the job. I was a volunteer in Gough Whitlam's office in 1977. When he was in opposition, I was at uni. And I used to go in and do a couple of hours filing for his secretary, Ros Byrne. And I'd just go in and do her filing. And occasionally this enormous red-faced man would walk past, say, slaves, coffee, and then walk into his office. And I met him once or twice. And John Button used to board in Ros Byrne's house in Canberra. And I don't know what happened, but I may have said to Ros I was looking for a job or something. Anyway, I started working for John Button when he was Shadow Minister for Communications in 1981. Then I went back to uni in 1982 and finished a law degree. And then in 1983, Hawke got in. And so I started working for John Button, and and the government had got in with a classic opposition's promise, which is General Motors Holden had sacked 14,000 workers, Ford was sacking people, and the Labor policy was that this was a disgrace, was all the government's fault, and that we would review it and fix it up. So no one had any idea what to do, and I was given this job, and it was completely fascinating. And it sort of I'd never studied economics, but I realized in retrospect that I understood a lot about economics because I'd been talking to my dad about it at the dinner table. And one of the strange things that happened was that I ended up making common cause not with the economists in what was then called the Industries Assistance Commission, is now called the Productivity Commission, and the Treasury, because they were, in ways that I can explain, extremists of a certain kind. And I basically made common cause. And then there was John Button's department, the Department of Industry and Commerce. It took me, 6 or 9 months. John Button said to me, "What do they want?" And I said, "I don't know." and it took me, 9 months to work out that they were following Jerry Seinfeld's principles of life, which is we're not thinking anything. We're just walking around, looking around. And they were they had this immensely complicated system of local content plans and limits here and special rules there. And they were just sort of having meetings with all the stakeholders and trying to keep them as happy as they could. So anyway, I ended up making common cause with people like Ed Visbord in the department and John Spazievich in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And these people were all economically trained, but they weren't economic zealots. They knew that local content plans made no damn sense. They were broadly free trading, but they didn't get themselves as tied up in the culture war of neoliberalism, of economic reform, and so on.
So could you explain the local content plan? This was highly interventionist industry policy, was it, for the car industry?
I'll start with a few riddles, if you like, a few questions, which is, what government body made an independent recommendation to have a local content plan for Australia in the car industry? Answer, the Tariff Board, which was the forerunner of the Industries Assistance Commission. That was in 1957, the year I was born. Then in 1965, Alf Ratigan was the chairman of the Productivity Commission, of the Tariff Board. And he's a kind of saint among us early neoliberals. And he recommended and he signed off on a report that recommended a local content plan as well. So he was figuring stuff out himself. Now, what the local content plan said was that in return for access to duty-free components, so there's a tariff of 35% on components. You can have free components if your local content is over 95%. Now, this was always a moving feast, and the big thing that came along was not really that killed the industry all on its own. We had the oil shock and a swing towards smaller cars that Australia was bad at making. And then all the policymakers looked at Japanese cars coming in and said, well, can we make those here? Which was a terrible idea. And so then what happened was that we watered down the local content plan for them to get them to assemble here. They started making cars at about 60% local content. 60% local content is basically zero, what a non-economist would think of as zero local content. There's virtually no pieces. You pick up some tires and some windscreen wipers and some spark plugs. But basically, this is a fully imported car, imported in pieces and stuck together in Australia. And then they fiddled, and then so there was a 65% local. So then we wanted to get their content up from 60% to 65%, and then so there was a 65% plan and a 95% plan, and of course, lots of fights between different factions of the industry. They're saying, well, so Holden and Ford would just say, well, thanks a lot. We're making serious cars here, and we are now discriminated against. These people have got access to 35% of their content duty free. So then the Department of Industry and Commerce would say, all right, well, we'll put quotas on these, so you can only make 30,000 of each of these things. And it just went on. It just went on and on. I mean, let me tell you one other thing, which was a thing called the non-reversion rule. And that was that if you had started buying brakes in Australia, and then your brake supplier was a lousy brake supplier, or for some other reason you wanted to change, you weren't allowed to. And you had to get permission from the reversion committee, which was a body that sat in the Department of Industry and Commerce. And I will say one further thing, which is that in 1974, under the Whitlam government, that rule had been torn up as part of tariff cuts and things like that. And there was a caucus revolt. And guess who moved the motion to retain the to retain the non-reversion rule. One junior, soon to be junior minister, then backbencher, member for Blaxland, need I say more, Paul Keating. Like Radigan, Paul Keating changed his tune on a lot of those things.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Just how differently we did things back then. I mean, the past is a foreign country, as they say, isn't it? Just extraordinary.
Yeah.
And what do you see as the highlights of that reform era of Hawke and Keating? What do you see as the real great achievements?
Well, obviously, cutting tariffs, getting rid of tariffs is a major highlight. I'll tell you something that I think we should put further up there. I know, Bruce Chapman will thank me for this, but it's not that it was a great intellectual piece of genius. And this is the higher education charge, HECS. Now, that was something that Milton Friedman had suggested. And it's just bleedingly obvious. And the reason and so what it is that the government sits there and says, well, we administer the tax system. That makes a great piece of infrastructure which we can build finance around, and we can say to people, we'll help you, we'll fund your education, and we'll once your income achieves a certain amount, we'll tax you more, and we will tax some of that money back. So I think of that as the sort of neoliberalism I would have liked to see far more of. We also did it for child support. So typically ex-husbands, but it doesn't have to be. It can be ex-wives who have left some partnership. Instead of the ramshackle system that is run by the courts, once you have a court order, we then run all that through the tax system, and it works like a charm.
Yeah. Can I ask about HECS? I was just going to ask about HECS, because that was very controversial at the time. I mean, I was probably in high school at the time, and I remember, like, you'd see all the news footage of the protests at university, and people were saying, "Oh, this is the end of free education, and we're going to be a backward nation."
Yeah,
there was a lot of controversy. What do you see as the benefits? I mean, did it allow an expansion of higher education?
Well, that was the argument, and I think the answer is yes. But I do. I think that the thing about HECS was that the argument for HECS, and again, it was a left-leaning neoliberal argument, and the argument picked up by the right, and the argument for people paying for their own tuition is that, guess who gets their own tuition? People who are predominantly wealthy, relatively speaking. So it's very hard to get around the fact that free education produces a subsidy from the least well-off to the comfortably well-off and the comfortably well-educated. Now, in fact, that gives me an opportunity to kind of complicate my story, because I'm not sure. Well, firstly, I didn't really agree with the way HECS was introduced. We were told fairly arbitrarily when it was Neville Wran was on the committee, and Bruce Chapman is the person the economist who's associated with this. The Wran committee, as I recall, recommended that HECS recover 20% of cost. Now, in my way of thinking, if you've become a lawyer and you've become extremely successful, I don't see any problem with asking you for 100% of those costs back. In fact, I don't see any problem with asking for 150% of those costs back. And that takes you back to the idea that, which again, neoliberalism expunged largely, which is progressive marginal tax rates. Australia has cut its top marginal tax rate like almost every other Western country. It still has one of the highest, which I think we can be proudest of. Now we can argue about when it should cut in, but this was one of the I don't know whether I can call it the jewels in the crown. It was a piece of common sense among economists of my father's generation that as you get more money, money becomes less important to you. And therefore, if you can take more money off wealthy people without messing up their investment decisions too much, either with their human capital or their physical capital, go for it. That's a good thing to do. So in a way, HECS is a nice segue because it shows you that these arguments that the neoliberals put were right and powerful, but they weren't complete. They weren't. So it's absolutely true that free education with the same existing tax system is a certainly in the short term a transfer of wealth, transfer income to the well-off and moderately well-off from the poor, or not the poor, but the working poor. So that should have been factored in. It wasn't factored in. So one of the things neoliberalism did is that it, a bit like modern university education, it kind of compartmentalized things and it said, university fees, we're going to talk about that as its own system. And there's some sense to do that, but it's all in a larger system and we've got to try and do both things.
Some other successes of what they call neoliberalism. Now, I'm a bit reluctant to use the term because it seems to be always used pejoratively.
Yeah.
You're this neoliberal economist, and as a way of dismissing what economists say. So I'm always wary of that term.
That's what always happens with such words.
Yes,
anyway,
yes.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking of other successes. There's the airline. Was it deregulation?
Yeah,
did we have a two-airline policy?
Yeah. The two-airline policy was crazy. But again, let's have a look at two-airline policy. So what we did was we had a kind of nutty system, and it was a compromise that Menzies made, because I think what happened was that Chifley was sort of halfway through nationalising airlines at the time. And so Menzies created this cosy little duopoly. And there were nice cartoons of a twin-bodied plane flying from Melbourne to Sydney with one of the fuselages had Ansett written on it and the other one had TAA, as it was called, Trans-Australian Airlines, which has subsequently was subsequently bought by Qantas. So that was a kind of complete mess, and it was like the local content plan. However, airlines are naturally very oligopolistic, and so that was an opportunity not to just think, well, I think deregulating the airline with a system was better than what we had. I think that's quite clear, but it sort of jumped it jumped out of the fire and into the frying pan. In other words, it's a bit better. But I think we could have done quite a lot better. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Because this is hard. It's hard to interact. Oligopolies are hard to interact with. Policy finds it hard to interact with oligopolies helpfully. It's one of the problems we have with supermarkets and things. But this is one of the things we could have done. At the same time as deregulating the airlines, or a little bit later actually, we implemented national competition policy. And national competition policy gave us the tools to say to Qantas, by the way, your terminal facilities, or some chunk of the terminal facilities that we require you to negotiate with us are, I think the term and the relevant act is infrastructure of national significance. And any newcomer, remember Compass was an old newcomer, and a recent one is Bonza Airlines, I think it was called. Any newcomer has a right to pay you a commercial price to access those resources. We didn't do that. And in fact, we did something quite different, which is we essentially allowed, and I'm pretty sure we would have been doing this while it was publicly owned or majority publicly owned. We allowed Qantas to do what oligopolists do, which is to have price wars, targeted price wars against any new entrant. And that's the exact opposite of the sort of behaviour that we want. And so here's two policy levers that we had, and we sort of behaved as if those policy levers didn't exist. They barely were discussed at the time. And one way of thinking about our failures in reform is to say that we went through a very comprehensive process of policy reform, and we had quite a powerful philosophy of private enterprise and really no philosophy of public enterprise, of the role of the public sector in being a good host for the most competitive possible private sector we could have.
Right. And so is this why, I think I've heard you say this before, or you've written it, that the microeconomic reform era, it contained the seeds of its own demise, or
yeah.
it set...
Well, I mean, what I would say is that it collapsed into a kind of reductive formula, and the reductive formula was that being market-oriented was somehow better than not. And so something like refashioning the CES, the Commonwealth Employment Services, as job active and as a network of private competitors. I'm not saying that's a terrible thing to do. I'm saying that if you do it, pay attention to the problems that the public sector, that the public system has tried to deal with, and be confident that you're doing a reasonable job on them. And if you can do that, then some of this might work. But we didn't really do that. We're in there, and VET, particularly in Victoria, we just said, this looks pretty, this is kind of competitive. This is sort of like supermarkets or something. And, it's not. These different sectors operate differently. And if you are going to play your role as a custodian of the public interest, you have to think about these things in a critical way, not in a formulaic way. So that's the way in which these ideas that, and I'm kind of romanticizing it a bit, I think, as a young person did what he saw people older than him do. But as I saw it when it was being built, this was an engine of human liberation in the spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment and Adam Smith. And it was a problem-solving mindset, and it became an ideology. It became a formula, and we just went from one difficult area of policy after another, saying, well, how hard can it be? We'll privatize electricity, or as much of it as we can. And then, oops, we got the regulation of rates of return wrong on transmission. Well, how much harm can that do? Well, $100 billion of too much investment. That's how much harm that did. That's not bad. That's not bad. Just a little glitch.
Yeah. There's certainly been problems, and if you're going to privatize monopolies or natural monopolies, then you need to have effective regulation. And we don't know a lot about the state of economic knowledge is not so great. We can help prevent things being a complete disaster, but the state of economics is not so great that we can be that helpful in producing a great result from a sector like that. But another thing that economic reform did really, I makes me quite angry actually, is that there were things that were being done that were obviously wrong economically, and which were not corrupt in the sense of money changing hands, although that might have happened, but corrupt in a policy sense, that the governments were getting away with mortgaging the public interest. And the example I give, I remember Chris Richardson telling me this at a conference now at
no, actually, he's not at Access Economics. I don't think a Deloitte Access Economics. I think he's plying his own trade. But I remember Chris Richardson telling me that the Commonwealth government was selling off its offices, and it was selling off its offices so that it could sell them to a property trust and rent them back, and the rent would be substantially more than the interest that they were paying. The rent would be about a real return of 7%, and the interest they were paying was a real return of 5%. Just a plan to miserize the public sector, and it's just work it out on a spreadsheet. Now, we've done this with tonight I'm driving out to the airport. If I go on the road that is the most direct route to the airport in Melbourne, I will pay $20 in fees for 15 minutes either way on a tollway. And that is much more than I would be paying, or the state would be paying, if the government had built that. And we replicated that. Sydney did this, and Melbourne did this, and it's being done much less now for various reasons, partly because these things have fallen over because the price, the private sector got better at doing them, and then ended up having to sharpen its pencil too much, and there were various bankruptcies. Queensland made these mistakes much less than the southern states, as I recall. You've had a few of them, but you've done rather well because you had a privately built train line to the airport, and that went broke. But I think the state did rather well out of that. Anyway, I'm not. You might know more detail.
It's costing us. It's controversial now because of that deal. It's a 30-year deal, and and certainly the state government got some money out of it, some reasonable money out of it, but because it overlaps with the Olympics, like the deal lasts longer than the Olympics, Brisbane City Council can't run buses to Brisbane Airport, and that's going to affect our ability to get people to the games.
Exactly. And so it's financially generally speaking, I don't know about the Brisbane train line, but generally speaking, this form of funding, because it uses private funding, not government borrowing, it's about 40% more expensive. But that's before you count these things where you have to sign away your ability to improvise using the infrastructure you have, which has happened in Melbourne. So we've widened the tollway to Tullamarine Airport. And of course, how do we do that? Well, the owner says, we don't really want to do that unless you extend our monopoly for another decade or two or three. So you're basically caught up in this evergreen monopoly, and you've signed away your ability to use infrastructure the way you need to use it. It's really terrible.
And so, I like the idea of, trying to use the private sector as much as possible, but I do recognise that in many cases, governments in the past have made decisions based on what they saw as a favourable short-term budget treatment, the wholesale and leaseback thing.
Well, let me make a rhetorical point, but it's a pretty important one. We call these mechanisms for these mechanisms for funding freeways public-private partnerships. In England, they're called the Private Finance Initiative. Now, I think it's really important. A really nice way to crystallise this is to say that roads are always public-private partnerships. It's just that they were good private-public partnerships when governments designed, funded, and then outsourced the building of them. That's an excellent interface between the public and the private sector. The public does its role, which is to stay in control of planning a city, and it's a cheaper source of funds. So if you keep that reasonably efficient, that's going to work for you. And then you've got the private sector grinding the gravel and running the steamrollers up and down and laying the concrete. That's exactly how, none of these roads are built by governments. They're funded by governments. They're planned by governments, and you really should have a good reason. And so saying you've got private funding when this is a thing that Tony Harris, the former Auditor General of New South Wales says, this stuff, we can't afford to build it. What absolute nonsense. We can't. That's simply not true. It's a sort of a throwaway line, and then you end up building something that's 40% too expensive and ties you up in knots for decades.
The other point I think is interesting is one John Quiggin makes. He gave a really good talk to Economic Society of Australia Queensland branch a few years ago, and his point is that, the issue with toll roads is that you're not thinking as the road network, as a whole system, and you can end up it can be inefficient in an economic sense because you've got and that's just basic.
That is what a transport economist will learn at university. And the transport economics that our system implemented didn't know any transport, didn't know any of that stuff. They just sort of said, market, we're going to stick a toll road here. All of these toll roads, if you ask the question, why a toll road there? Well, that's just because a particular politician had a particular thing that they wanted to do at a particular time. There's no logic to any of that.
Yeah. And so we've got arterial roads clogged, but yet we've got toll roads which are which could take some of that traffic, but because there's a toll on it, people aren't hopping on it.
And in fact, as you would know, Gene, I hope I'm not being presumptuous. I think you would agree with this. The standard economic textbook answer is, if you want to put tolls on roads, put them on the old clogged ones, not on the new, not on the new ones that are not congested. That's where the opportunity costs are.
Yeah. So you should be charging the congestion charging that economists talk about. That's absolutely. Right. Yeah. I'm just thinking we'll probably have to start wrapping up soon, but I want to ask you before we go about this great quote from Colin Clark in an article you wrote. You put it in your compare and contrast article about in the early days of the Rudd government in 2008. And Colin Clark at the time he was working here in Brisbane, I think, in Queensland, as economic advisor.
No. He
wasn't.
No, he was working for Keynes in England, and he went back to Queensland. That's
right.
where the quote. That's the. Actually, it says I want to stay in Australia. So what must have happened is Colin Clark, a great Australian economic historian and economist who was instrumental in building national accounting, I guess he must have been at Cambridge, possibly was at LSE, but he was a big contributor to the iconocracy, the iconocrats in such as they were in the United Kingdom. I think this is in the 30s. And Keynes says to him, I think Keynes had the same sort of attitude to Australia as Churchill did, which is arse end of the world, basically. What the hell would you want to go there? So do you want to read it? I can read it.
If you'll read it with more passion, I think, than I will. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So John Maynard Keynes is saying, look, come to England. We'll get the band back together. There's really important work to be done here. And he says, I am reaching the conclusion I want to stay in Australia. People have minds which are not closed to new truths, as the minds of so many Englishmen are. Of course, Keynes would have agreed with him about that. And with all the mistakes Australia has made in the past, I still think she may show the world in economics. And I think of that as a sort of, we did show the world. We showed the world with Australian exceptionalism until around about 2001, and then the politics as usual caught up with us.
We might have to come back and talk about, how we might reinvigorate that exceptionalism.
Yeah, that'd be good. That'd be good.
I think it's having honest conversations and not believing your own. We seem to have too many fixed positions on some of these issues, and ideology plays a role. But I think to resolve some of these, we really have to be much more open. And just have those conversations. But
I agree with that, and I also think that there are a lot of people. It's easy to pose as an expert about these things. And the experts, actually, there's a marvelous quote from, and I'm he was the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and he resigned on a matter of principle about Vietnam, and his name was Tom Fitzgerald. And he gave the Boyer lectures. You can't get them on the net, which infuriates me. And he said that Paul Samuelson, the great post-war economist, talked about my down under heroes. And what he was talking about was the way in which the economists of the Brigden Committee in the 1930s anticipated his ideas about factor proportions driving trade. And Tom Fitzgerald said that that good economic policy relies on talented amateurs. It relies on a kind of, people like Henry George, a 19th century economist who came up with a very simple and incredibly important idea and was and other more learned economists were rude about him, basically. But I'll try and find that quote. But my point is that, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but I worked for two ministers, and one of them had an economics degree, John Dawkins, and then I saw Paul Keating in action. I'm not a huge fan of Paul Keating, but Paul Keating had a terrific intuition about what economics was about. He was the only one who could, on the Sunday interview program, explain, not that he used these terms, he could explain the principle of comparative advantage. He could explain why it wasn't in Australia's interest to have trade barriers, even if other countries had trade barriers. And so in that sense, that's what we need. But what I'm getting at is that everyone and their dog and all the journalist class, they pose as economic experts, and almost an awful lot of these people are kind of surfing. They're kind of they're going with the vibe. But they're not, they don't have a real regard for the simplicity, and this is an odd word to use, but the beauty of some of the basic ideas in economics. And that means they just end up confused and following the latest trend, the latest fad.
Yeah.
Economics is about problem solving, and there's this whole discipline. It helps a little bit, but it's mostly about problem solving on the merits.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I think you've given some good examples of how there was that problem solving approach in the 80s. You talked about HECS and, the various other innovations. It certainly was an incredible reform period.
Yeah.
And
another problem we had was the trade deficit. It wasn't entirely clear whether we should regard it as a problem. That was a controversy in itself. But what we did was we adopted a very principled approach, which, it was haggled through politics, but that was the superannuation system. Now, again, I'm quite critical of certain aspects of the superannuation system, but I think I participated as an amateur in this debate that people rather like, which is, why did New Zealand do so much worse than Australia? And we were both economic reformers, and I don't think anyone really knows. But I think one of the reasons is that we gave ourselves access to a big pot of savings, and we lowered the cost of investment in Australia. And the New Zealanders did the opposite. They're, I think, the only developed world country that doesn't have a capital gains tax, certainly doesn't have an effective one. And I think those things might matter. But that was an example of a bit like the tariff cut, an example of a series of themes being run together and turning into a policy solution to a range of problems. Of course, as is almost inevitable with a system like as big as that, especially set up by politicians, advised by economists, we didn't get much of a look into certain aspects of it. It also created some new problems, but there you are. Life goes on, and we try and solve those as well.
Yeah. I'll have to have a closer look at New Zealand. the big thing I think about is, I mean, we're lucky we've got iron ore and coal, and New Zealand's got sheep. So, I mean, it's, we've been very fortunate in some of the minerals that we have and that we can export. Although there's an argument over whether we're properly taxing the economic rents that are earned off those resources.
That might be right. But then again, I think right now we're in the grip of a mild form of the resource curse. And, the wealthiest, the countries that have done well in the last 35, 40 years have been resource poor countries. New Zealand has some fantastic assets in tourism, in dairy, could have tried to set itself up as an offshore bank, in offshore banking. Now that wouldn't do the world any favours, but it might have done New Zealand some favours, the way the Irish managed to get some favours done for it. Anyway, they weren't really thinking, like that. And, but look, I don't know. And I think it's the other possibility with New Zealand is that its distance from major markets started to matter more than it mattered in the 1970s. But it's quite remarkable that New Zealand and Australia have exactly the same standard of living until 1970, and then they just diverge, and now they're about 25% less well off. One other thought is that there are two countries in the developed world, two English-speaking countries that effectively have an elective dictatorship, and they're the English-speaking countries that have done worst, the UK and New Zealand. They have a single house. They have no federal infrastructure. So the game is you head for the centre, you persuade the centre to do what you want, and then it does what it wants. And it turns out that might not be such a distributing power and having more deals and more log rolling, more deals done to in the way that we do in the Senate. Of course, it's like Bismarck said, it's like making sausages. It's better if you don't see them being made, but the result turns out to be better.
Yeah, very good. Okay, Nicholas Gruen, that was good. I learned a lot about your experience in the reform era, and some highlights from it, and just thinking about how we might do better in the future. So,
well, there we are. We've got a teaser for the next episode.
I think so. So, you happy to wrap up here?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay,
good,
very good.
Okay.
And thanks everyone for watching and listening. Really appreciate it. And Nicholas, I'll catch up with you sometime soon for another uncomfortable collision with reality.
Thank you.